Here we go. Good morning, Timothy.
How are you doing, Maya?
I'm doing fine. How are you doing?
It's Golden Week. We're in day 2 of Golden Week.
Yes, indeed. Absolutely. And you look fabulous.
Thank you.
So, are you in Katsuyama again?
I'm in I'm in Katsuyama. I had a plan to sail to the islands of Oshima. I had a little bit of boat problems, so I'm still trying to fix my boat problems before I take off. Evan and I, Captain Evan, and I still might take off today. It just depends on how much we can fix the problem.
I see. I hope that you can do that 100%.
Yeah, I do too.
And that it will be okay until you get to the next shore. Right. So it's the Golden Week, but a lot of things have happened in Japanese politics this past week, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing what happened there. So let's start without any further delay.
Thank you very much, Maya, and good morning, everybody who is tuning in to this podcast, this briefing every Sunday, 8:20. We try and give you what's the latest in Japanese politics. The Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida is enjoying unprecedented popularity. He has the higher number of popularity, the highest number of popularity now than he did when he first started, and that's quite rare. Most of the time, Japanese prime ministers, they start high on a bit of a roll. They have about 100-day honeymoon, as in most democracies in the United States as well. There's a bit of a honeymoon there, and then they become challenged with the realities of running the country and dealing with the different issues that come through the bureaucracy. Mr. Kishida, on the other hand, is enjoying a higher popularity now than when he first took office. This is something unusual. It's attributed mostly to his response to COVID and his response to the sanctions against Russia. Those are underpinned, at least the sanctions for Russia are underpinned by Japan's reliance and relationship with the United States and the Biden administration strong desire to project unity of purpose and unity of design. And of course, the United States and Japan relationship is probably one of the strongest in the world, in the free world, among the G20. And Mr. Kishida, being a new prime minister, is really eager to form that kind of relationship that Mr. Abe certainly had, and Mr. Suga really didn't have time to establish. And I think he's well on his way to doing that. You can see that the Japanese response has been quite unusual, a little bit out of character in terms of speed and in terms of velocity and power behind it. For example, the acceptance of Ukrainian refugees, and not only the refugees, but their dogs too. You know, for people who have come to Japan on business or even diplomats, you can't just bring your cat or your dog in on a diplomatic pouch. There's quite a long quarantine, about 180 days most of the time. And the quarantine restrictions for even the pets has been almost eliminated. That's a really nice thing. It's really great because, you know, when refugees are in that kind of a situation, when people generally are in that kind of situation, the stress factor is just through the roof. So it's it's really a nice thing to see, but it is really out of character for the Japanese to do that and to be so open-armed. It's great, and it resonates with the Japanese people, and it's pushed the popularity of the prime minister up. Similarly with COVID, I think the worst of COVID is behind us, and we're starting to emerge, but he's being very tempered in his response. There has been some communications about relaxing the mask mandate just this week. there are some medicines that are coming out of the Japanese medical industry as well. And allowing tourists to come in, it's still kind of up in the air. But business travelers have started pretty robustly. Visitors over Golden Week to Hawaii are at about 60% of what they were in 2019. So it's not 100%, but it is significantly making good progress. And domestic travel is at about 67% of what it was in 2019. So we're going to see a lot of probably trepidation with regard to COVID coming back, because as we all know, it's always the foreigners that are bringing in COVID, and part of that is kind of true. There is a high preponderance of COVID infected people coming into the country, even Japanese, after visiting foreign countries. So Narita and Haneda are having real congestion problems. Even before we got into Golden Week, Mr. Kishida authorized the acceptance of 10,000 visitors per day. It was at 2,000, then 3, then 7, and just recently at 10. So it is beginning to open up quite a bit. 10,000 is not the full gambit. It's not the whole thing, but it is a relaxation. But it is testing the capabilities of the medical facilities at Narita and at Haneda. You might think that that's somewhat strange because the Japanese are really good at some things, and this would be one of them. But the problem is that neither airport was built for those kind of accommodations, those kind of facilities. So people have been complaining coming in from overseas that the wait is 5 hours, sometimes 7 hours for getting through the procedure. But on the other hand, for those people coming in from the countries that have been authorized as relatively COVID-free, that have their vaccine passports or some sort of evidence of passports, and then they have their pre-boarding test approved and non-negative, and then they come in and have another one, they come in relatively quickly. So the long and the short of it is that the Prime Minister is doing extremely well. He's doing well for a lot of reasons that are maybe circumstantial, has nothing to do with him. He has been a little bit timid. He flip-flopped a bit when he first took office, and I think he's beginning to get a little bit more wind in his sails. But also, as we know, whenever there's trouble at home, a safe haven is to go internationally. It's easier to gain credibility and generate respect and admiration when you're going overseas, and this Prime Minister has really done that. He's using the Golden Week to visit 5 countries. Can you believe that? He's visiting 5 countries. Mr. Hayashi is also, the foreign minister, is also visiting several countries during Golden Week. This is a time, you know, typically when Japanese politicians also visit Washington, D.C. and other major capitals of the world, because, I mean, how often does Japan actually take an extended break like this? So there's a lot going on diplomatically, and that always, you know, puts a lot of wind in the sails of any political leader. So he's really maxing that out, but I think he's doing a good job at it. You know, foreign visitors also visit Japan. It doesn't always make big news, but in the context of what's going on with COVID, what's going on with Ukraine, what's going on with Russia and the expulsion of several diplomats, you know, the fact that we received the Prime Minister of New Zealand, we hosted German's Chancellor Scholz just this last week, and there just seems to be a steady flow of international visitors coming in. With regard to the German Chancellor coming in, this was his first foreign visit, and he chose Japan to do it. That's a huge, it's a signal. His largest trading partner is China, not Japan, but he chose to visit Japan as well, or Japan first. And he actually said in a press release that it was for sending the signal that Japan is important to us, and we stand by Japan, and we appreciate Japan's stance with regard to the sanctions and with regard to their handling of how they're dealing with Russia. You can also see that, excuse me, you can also see that the Prime Minister's popularity is rising because there was an election. We talked about this in our last briefing in Ishikawa. Ishikawa has 5 parliamentary seats. 2 of them are in the upper house, 3 of them are in the lower house. The LDP occupies all of those seats. One of the members of the upper house, one of the 2 seats, became vacant. And since there's not enough time, or there's too much time between now and the upper house election, they had to have a by-election. That was held on Sunday. And people knew that the LDP would win, and the calibration of success and the amount of appreciation of the current prime minister is calibrated not by winning or losing, but how much they win by. So in 2016, 3 elections ago, so the election for the upper house is every 3 years. And in that election, the LDP candidate won by a ratio of 1.76 votes for every vote that was cast for the opposition. In the last election in 2019, it was 1.99, almost 2 votes for every vote cast for the opposition. So a lot of people were looking at what the results were this year in this by-election to calibrate what kind of feeling or sentiment there is for the current administration, and in particular for Mr. Kishida. The results came in last week, and it was 3.16. So for every opposition vote, more than 3 votes were cast for the LDP, which supports the current view that the LDP is doing well. There is much appreciation there. No screw-ups, no scandals. You'd remember that, scandals are part and parcel of Japanese politics. There's always a role that scandal plays in lifting or bringing people down. And we've been into the Kishida administration now for a little bit more than half a year. And it's been very clean, very quiet, and they've been on a steady course. We still are a little bit unsure about, what the new capitalism looks like. He said that he would release his stance on many of those issues, including, what to do with the new startups, what to do with COVID, what to do with the supplemental package before the election. So there are a lot of things that are kind of waiting. He's made pronouncements about that. There has been progress being made in several of these, but nothing really solid. There are a couple of solid things that have come out, and I'd like to get into those later in the briefing. But another thing that's coming up that you should keep your eye on is we've talked about Quad several times. Excuse me for the frog in the throat. We've talked about Quad several times in these briefings, and that Quad meeting will now be held on the 22nd of this month. So today's the 1st of May. In 21 days, the Prime Minister will be meeting with the President of the United States, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, and also the Premier of India will be here, Mr. Modi. The interesting thing about that is, India is kind of, it's a little bit of a left foot of this 4-party Quad arrangement, because it is so intimately tied with Russia. Most of its defense capabilities is reliant on Russian hardware. But India and Japan share a really unique relationship. They just had their 70th anniversary of diplomatic relations. It's interesting to note that when the peace treaty was signed in San Francisco at the end of World War II, India didn't partake in that signing. Instead, it had a bilateral signing with Japan. So the relationship is very long, it's very deep. It's not as rich because of the distance and because of just the difference of agendas, but it is a very strong relationship. And I think you're going to see something coming out of Quad. The President Biden will be here, and then from here he'll go to South Korea. The other delegation that visited Mr. Kishida, just this week was a delegation from the president-elect of South Korea, an 8-party delegation. They were here for 5 days. They came with not so much of an agenda of things to do beyond, improving this relationship. The president-elect will be inaugurated on May 10th in 9 days, and he will become the president of South Korea. And he sent this delegation over to mend ties and to really do what the United States needs and what really Japan needs too. I think the United States needs Japan and Korea to be on better terms than they are now, more than Japan needs it. But in light of what's going on in China and in Russia and in North Korea, this bond between Japan, South Korea, North Korea South Korea and Japan really needs to be on a different footing. And the president-elect has said that he wants to change this dynamic and change the atmosphere here. So he's already made a couple of pronouncements about the agreement to reconcile about what happened during the colonial period. So we're kind of on a more even foot. His election was only by a slim margin, so he does have people that are opposed to, him cozying up to the Japanese. But similarly, the prime minister here, there are people in the LDP that are opposed to a closer relationship. But I think it is so vital for the region, and I think that's being acknowledged. There's been another kind of a unfortunate flare-up. The Solomon Islands has signed an agreement with China to let Chinese vessels visit their ports. They've made some agreements on infrastructure, and some of the terms and conditions of the agreement have been made or were made secret, and that upset a lot of people. So there's a lot of activity going on right now. Foreign Minister Hayashi will visit Palau this week, over the weekend, not to the Solomon Islands, but close by one of the islands there, because this is a really big deal of giving China a foothold there and not really understanding the terms and conditions. You can imagine that the Solomon Islands received a pretty good deal out of that, because it's so important to China to have that kind of a foothold. But this is where World War II, many of the fiercest battles were fought because of the value, the strategic value of these properties. So I think you're going to see a little bit more coming up here. Also, with regard to that, Okinawa is also a very important component of that mix. This has nothing to do with China per se, but they had a poll just recently. And by the way, the 50th year anniversary of the reversion of Okinawa back to Japan is on May 15th. So it's been 50 years when Richard Nixon relinquished control of Okinawa back to Japan. They did a poll on that in anticipation of the celebrations that are coming up. And the vast majority of Okinawan people appreciated and are in favor and acknowledge what was done by that reversion and their appreciation for Japan taking control. They feel almost 70% of them feel that their political interests are more covered. They feel more safe and secure politically. They do feel overburdened by the U.S. presence, and they would like to have a little bit more consideration there. Although Japan, Okinawa only represents 0.6%, 0.6% of the total land mass of Japan. It hosts 67% of U.S. forces. So some people think it hosts 100%. That's not true. 67% of the land devoted exclusively to U.S. support is located in Okinawa. That's a high number. They would like to reduce that, and they've got an LDP panel that is studying that. And I think, in fact, they're going to make great headway there in terms of percentages. But if you look at what's going on with the national budget and the defense spending and the capabilities that are being requested by the LDP to go into the new defense strategy report, I think what's going to happen is that the distribution will not be reduced in Okinawa per se. It will just grow in other areas. So percentage-wise, yes, it will decline. But I don't think that the Okinawan people are going to feel that much more relieved. On the other hand, Okinawa is the poorest prefecture and of all the prefectures. It has the highest standard, the highest longevity, and it's got the largest number of old people that are living there and the highest number of children proportionately. So there are some things that are going great in Okinawa. They want some relief. They want a little bit more respect. Governor Tamaki was visited by U.S. Ambassador Rahm Emanuel. That's, that's significant. It was reported in the press, and probably in anticipation of the reversion on May 15th, there'll be lots of celebrations, and probably he'll go down there during that time too. The yen is in a significant decline. I think everybody has been following that. You're seeing it. It's at a 20-year low now. The decrease, the drop has been precipitous. Over the last 7 weeks, the yen has lost 10% of its value. This hasn't happened since 2013, that the yen has been at this low rate. The consumer price index is really fluctuating in a very bad way. Energy prices right now stand at around 20% of what they were this time last year, and food prices are shooting up at about 2%. That occurred just in the last month of March. So there is cause for alarm. You might remember that there was a G7, G20 meeting in Washington, D.C. 2 weeks ago. Finance Minister Suzuki visited on the G20. He was trying to make as much headway as he could on clamoring about the weakening yen. He didn't get much support from the other G7 members. There are a couple of international conventions about keeping currency fluctuations in line. I think he's beginning to lose a little bit of confidence in that. He's had private meetings with Janet Yellen, the U.S. Treasury Secretary, and the notes of that meeting are very hush-hush. I think there's a lot that was discussed there about potentially rescuing Japan in this crunch that they've got. The amount of money that Japan has in terms of debt is the highest of the G20. It is just astronomical for GDP. It's about 267% of that. Even in the United States, they have a debt ratio, but it's at about 120%. So it is very large, but when you look at the Japanese, it's just astronomical, and it's unsustainable. At the same time, you've got Japanese spending enormously on supplemental budgets and rescue plans for COVID, and also for helping the Ukrainians and sending aid there. The Komeito and the LDP had a little bit of a fight over pushing through a supplemental budget. The LDP essentially agreed that it would pass a supplemental budget, but it wanted to push it off until after the election on July 10th. We've talked about this before. The prime minister wanted to push it off there. Komeito insisted, the junior partner insisted that we have the supplemental budget before the election, so the population, the electorate, can see how hard we're working and how much we're trying to devote to fixing the economy. The prime minister and the administration succumbed to that request, and so they're working hard now on a supplemental budget in the amount of about 6 trillion yen. This is massive. Part of this is being taken from the budget that was passed when Mr. Kishida first became prime minister. You might remember that they passed a supplemental budget very quickly before the end of the year. Part of that was devoted to crisis management for COVID relief, and they're going to take that and dedicate it to some of the other programs that he's talking about now. But 6.1 trillion yen for a supplemental budget will be passed before this election in less than 2 months. So it's there's a lot going on. A part of the supplemental budget will be devoted to just cash giveaways for every child. So children now are considered to be 18 years or less. It used to be 21 years until just this year. So now families who have children will get gomayan, that's 50,000 yen per child, relatively soon, before the election. So there's a little bit of suspicion going on there. Please love me and here's some money for loving me and remember me at the polling booth. There's a little bit of that going on. I think the LDP wisely wanted to avoid that. But, having some money in the pocket also helps Komeito too. And Komeito can properly say that they endorsed that, they promoted it, they forced the LDP to assume this line so that you voters can have that money in your pocket sooner rather than later. So they both share a little bit of that, but I'm not so much into predictions, but I think there's really hell to pay after the elections. There's so much spending going on. The yen is in so much trouble. The prices are going up. The inflation is really becoming, the Bank of Japan president, his name just slipped my mind, Hiroyuki Kuroda. He's been struggling to get inflation to a manageable 2% ever since he's been in office. He's been in office 9 years. This is his 10th year. He needs to give up the ghost. They'll get a new Bank of Japan president appointed by the prime minister this year. But he's now kind of wishing his wish has come true and he's going to overshoot that. The yen has gone past 130 just this last week. It's, just keep watching that. I think it'll go to 135 within the month. And 150 is certainly within consideration before the summer is out. So this is bad for the Japanese economy. It's good for the exporters, but it's bad for the people who are, importing material for producing things. Toyota had a banner year. You might have seen that they've reduced their earnings, but they're producing more of their product overseas. It's just like Panasonic and Mitsubishi. They've farmed out most of the manufacturing to Southeast Asia and to other countries, even the United States and in Europe, rather than doing it at home, which is what the model was in the 80s. So they've farmed that out. So less of the production is going on here, obviously because of the declining birth rate, the amount of people who are there to work, the influx of the young kids into the population centers, which has generated, as we've discussed, this disparity of voters versus number of people in parliament in various districts, this fight between the districts that have too many politicians supported by too few voters, giving those particular voters a disproportionate weight in selecting their representatives than the people that live in the cities. So the Supreme Court has said the Japanese government needs to gerrymander. It's not quite gerrymandering, it's actually taking some of these politicians' seats away and putting them in the highly populated areas. But in any event, the population dynamic is just, everything is coming to something of a head. You're not hearing a whole lot about it. You're hearing a lot about Mr. Kishida, you're hearing a lot about Russia, Ukraine, you're hearing about North Korea, China, the administration. There are other issues. The yen, it doesn't get a whole lot of play because it's somewhat complicated. And then you've got the stimulus packages. I think after the election, a lot of roosters are going to come home to roost, and it's going to be quite a different gig for the prime minister. So stay tuned to that, and we'll keep our eye on it and continue to report to you. The LDP has submitted its proposal for defense spending. It is promoting a complete revamp of the defense policy strategy. Several documents are submitted to the Diet from time to time on defense spending, on military posture. This year, the Defense Ministry has submitted to the LDP the proposal that will be considered and then passed within this year for new policy on what Japan is going to be doing militarily and diplomatically. So they have revised, they're proposed revising Japan's most important defense documents, that is the National Security Strategy document, the National Defense Guidelines, and the Medium-Term Defense Buildup Program. These are going under significant revision. We've talked about this before. They're also proposing, Japan has long hovered their defense spending around 1% of GDP. It rarely exceeds 1%, but hovering around there. It is not a mandate. It's not written in the Constitution. It's just a policy that has been followed for a long time. All of that is changing with what's going on in Ukraine, what's going on in North Korea, the potential for China moving on Taiwan and the implications there, and also the buildup and a lot of the things that are going on in the Northern Territories that are upsetting Japan has now pushed Japan to change its policy to go from 1% to 2%. That's massive. That is doubling the defense spending. And so the Okinawans concerned about, we want to be reduced a little bit of the reliance on supporting the U.S. bases. That's where this comes from, that there is going to be more spending, but it's not going to be just in Okinawa. I think it's going to be in other areas and probably also in Aomori and Hokkaido, because these are really delicate spots. We've been talking about the joint flotilla that sailed through the inland sea, the Japan Sea, with China and Russia warships about 4 months ago. The submarine missile tests, the Russian submarine missile tests, the overflights. It's just really somewhat alarming, and I think this is the reaction to it. And this kind of reaction, it hasn't happened. I mean, even in the defense strategy or in the diplomatic blue book, kind of the Bible for diplomats, it hasn't even mentioned the Northern Territories since 2013, and now it is becoming a major component in these documents. The Japan government has stated boldly that the Northern Territories are inherent properties of Japan and that Russia is illegally occupying them. Those are very strong words. Typically, Japan has had somewhat of a collaborative or at least it hasn't been so front and center about the Northern Territories, especially with Mr. Abe. He spent a lot of time trying to cajole, Russia and Mr. Putin to open trade, to let visitors come visit the sites, the grave sites, to have, non-visa travel, that sort of thing. That's all come to a crashing halt now. You'll remember that Russia, 8 Russian diplomats were expelled 2 weeks ago. They got on a bus last week, and Russia finally retaliated this week and announced the expulsion of 8 Japanese diplomats in Moscow. It doesn't include, neither of them include the prime minister. That would be just so outlandish. But it is very rare, I think, for people who follow Japan, Japanese politics, Japanese diplomacy. It's extremely rare for any country to be so offended by Japan that it would expel some diplomats. I mean, Japan is not known as, being involved in espionage or, doing nefarious things almost ever. I mean, it happens, but it's quite rare. So the expulsion, the reasons for the expulsion was just the hostile attitude of Japan towards Russia and the expulsion of their diplomats. So it was a bit of a tit for tat. So I think this report sounds somewhat dour. I don't mean it to be, but I think it's just the reality of the situation. The diplomatic blue book identifying Russia in not so friendly terms, it's a big deal. They're losing their most favored nation status, which pushes up costs. Yes, there was a deal with salmon and fisheries, but most of that is reliant on, just improving foodstuffs to Japan, and of course, the cash the Russians are grateful for. So that agreement was reached this last week. But the conciliatory nature of Japan towards Russia has ended. And so we're entering a new phase, something very new to Japan, at least over the last 15, not quite 20 years, but at least in the last 15 years, Japan's stance has been conciliatory and trying to develop that relationship. That is flipped. And when something like this flips, it's like the yen. When the yen starts creeping, it has a tendency to continue like that. And similarly in diplomacy, especially with regard to the Northern Territories, I think you're going to see that this is on a coast that's going to get worse before it gets better. North Korea celebrated their 90th anniversary of the birth of the founder of the current North Korean government. His son had a huge parade, had a beautiful white military outfit, and then they paraded all of their military armament. I was afraid that this was on Monday of last week, by the way, and I was afraid that North Korea would use this opportunity to perhaps show once again its strength and its dedication to projecting its influence. It didn't do that. It just had a great military parade. But over the last couple of weeks, there has been evidence of them repairing their test facilities. You might remember that they destroyed some of the tunnels and the facilities in a show to prove that they were backing off a little bit. They were getting some concessions from the United States. The United States was toning things down. President Trump visited and put his arm around. He didn't. He kind of put his arm around the shoulder of the current dear leader. But in getting there, there were some concessions that were made, and now those concessions are being walked back. So you can anticipate other things going. He was very boisterous about North Korea's military capability and the fact that he was dedicated to continue this process and to spare no expense to get North Korea's military capabilities at an even higher level and to enhance the capabilities they currently have. So it's a worrying thing that we need to keep an eye on. South Korea, as I said, the president-elect delegation left yesterday. I think they had a very successful 5-day tour here. And I think the relations between Japan and South Korea are on the cusp of flourishing. You've got President Biden, who will be here on the 22nd and the 23rd, and then he will be in South Korea on the 24th. So there's a lot to look forward to. Sorry to not get to all of the issues, but those are the top ones that are hitting my radar. I'd like to open the floor up, Maya, and see what other issues people in the audience have, or to discuss some of the issues that we exposed today. Thank you very much, Maya.
Thank you to you, because I gather that you did a lot of preparation. Thank you for that again. So, yes, and we already have quite a few comments on the other side of Clubhouse. So please hurry up and get over there.
Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to sign off here on LinkedIn, and I'll go immediately into Clubhouse, and we can have this discussion till around 10 o'clock, and then I will get back on the boat and sail away.
Absolutely, yes. Okay, so thank you. I will see you on the other side then.
See you on the other end. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.